They say you don't realize the weight of a lie until it crushes you. I used to believe I was too smart, too careful, too in control for that. But as I sit here, staring at yet another rejection email, I wonder if I ever really had control at all. It started as a calculated risk, a small, necessary evil to secure my future. Mason had everything: his business, his confidence, his annoyingly perfect life. And I had, what? A stagnant career, a marriage built on resentment, and the gut-wrenching certainty that if we divorced on his terms, I'd walk away with nothing. So, I made a choice. A whispered accusation. A few tears. The kind of betrayal that doesn't come with bruises but leaves scars all the same. And for a while, it worked. Until it didn't. Now, Mason is richer than ever, untouched by the scandal I tried to create, while my name is a quiet warning in every hiring office I step into. And the worst part? I'm starting to think he knew all along. There was a time when I thought Mason and I were a team. A partnership. A force that would take on the world together. I was wrong. I met Mason when I was 24, fresh out of college with a marketing degree and a head full of plans. He was 26, a guy with no degree but a sharp mind and a relentless work ethic. He'd already started his own business, nothing impressive back then, just a small contracting company with a beat-up truck and a few underpaid workers. I remember thinking he was reckless, a risk-taker, the kind of man who would either crash and burn or make it big. I should have known he'd be the latter. Mason was magnetic in a way I couldn't quite explain. He wasn't loud or showy like the men I had dated before, but there was something about him, his confidence, his certainty. When Mason said something, he meant it. No second-guessing, no hesitation. And maybe that's what drew me in. Back then, I had my own dreams. A corporate career, a corner office, the kind of success that would make my parents proud. And at first, Mason was my biggest cheerleader. He'd listen when I talked about marketing trends and brand strategies, nodding along even though I knew half of it didn't interest him. "You're gonna be unstoppable," he'd say, squeezing my hand. "They won't know what hit them." And I believed him. But life has a way of rearranging priorities. Somewhere between job applications that led nowhere and Mason's business taking off, I started working part-time. It was supposed to be temporary, a way to figure things out while Mason's long hours at the office kept us afloat. Then suddenly, years passed, and Mason wasn't just running a business, he was building an empire. While I was stuck in neutral, he was speeding ahead, landing big contracts, hiring more people, upgrading from that beat-up truck to a sleek, black one that turned heads. I told myself I was happy for him. And I was. Mostly. But there was a shift between us. A slow, creeping distance that settled in before I even realized it was happening. I started noticing how people looked at Mason when we went out, how they admired him, respected him. How they asked him questions about his company, his plans, his future. And me? I became Mason's wife. The woman who held down the house while he built his empire. The woman who smiled at the right moments but never really had anything impressive to add. I hated that feeling. So I started pushing back in small ways. Little jabs here and there. A comment about how he never finished high school. A teasing remark about how I had to help him with paperwork because he still typed with 2 fingers. They were jokes, harmless banter. At least, that's what I told myself. But Mason never snapped back. He never argued, never defended himself. He'd just look at me with this unreadable expression, one that made me feel like maybe I was the one being tested. I should have stopped then. I should have seen the warning signs. But I didn't. Because deep down, I was still convinced I was the smart one. The one who had the upper hand. The one who could never be outplayed. I had no idea just how wrong I was. I used to think resentment was loud. That it came in the form of shouting matches, slammed doors, and dramatic ultimatums. But the truth is, resentment is quiet. It creeps in, slow and subtle, like a small crack in glass that spreads before you even realize the whole thing is about to shatter. It started with small things. The way Mason would come home later and later, always with a perfectly reasonable excuse. Long day at the office. Had to check on a site. Met with a new investor. Logical, responsible things. Things I couldn't argue with. And yet, something about it felt off. Not because he was lying, I knew Mason well enough to know he wasn't the type to make up excuses. No, what bothered me was how effortless it all seemed for him. Success, money, admiration, they all followed Mason like he was born to have them. Meanwhile, I was stuck in place, waiting for something to change, for my own life to suddenly take off the way his had. But nothing ever did. I wasn't naive enough to say Mason had changed. He was the same man I married, calm, composed, frustratingly unreadable. No, the one who had changed was me. I started watching him differently. Noticing things I had ignored before. The way he'd check his phone during dinner, his face impassive as he typed out a reply. The way he'd pause before answering a question, like he was deciding how much to say. The way he never seemed surprised by anything, like he was always 2 steps ahead. I don't know when it hit me, the realization that no matter how much I tried to push Mason, to needle him, to test his patience, he never truly reacted. Not in anger, not in frustration. It was like he was watching me, waiting. That was when the doubt started. Was I losing him? Had I already lost him? I tried to brush the thoughts away, but they lingered. A slow, gnawing unease that settled in my chest, making it hard to breathe. So, I did what any woman in my position would do. I fought for control in the only way I knew how. I made myself indispensable. I started showing up at Mason's office unannounced, bringing him coffee or lunch like a devoted wife. His employees loved it. "You've got a good one, boss," they'd say with knowing smiles. Mason would kiss my cheek, murmur a soft, "Thanks, babe," and go right back to work, unaffected. I tried dressing differently. Sleek, professional outfits that screamed power, the kind of woman who belonged next to a man like Mason. But if he noticed, he never said a word. I even pushed myself to network, to finally use that marketing degree for something. I went to events, schmoozed with people who barely remembered my name, tried to carve out a place for myself. But every conversation always circled back to Mason. "How's his business doing? He's really making a name for himself. You must be so proud." Proud. That was the word people used when they didn't know what else to say. As if I was nothing more than an accessory to his success. I started to wonder if Mason saw me the same way. And if he did, was it always like this? Had I been blind to it all along? I told myself I was overthinking, that every marriage had rough patches. But there were moments, fleeting, sharp little moments, where I caught something in his eyes. Not anger. Not annoyance. Something worse. Understanding. Like he saw straight through me. Like he had been waiting for this. The thought started as a whisper. A fleeting, almost ridiculous notion that barely registered before I pushed it away. But once an idea takes root, it doesn't just disappear. It lingers, waiting for the right moment to grow. At first, it was harmless, just a fantasy I entertained when Mason came home late without an explanation. A quiet, indulgent daydream where I wasn't the one losing. Where I wasn't the one being left behind while he surged ahead. I didn't even realize when the fantasy started to take shape, when it turned into something sharper. Something actionable. It wasn't about revenge. Not at first. It was about fairness. I had sacrificed for Mason. I had put my dreams on hold, supported him, stood by his side while he built everything we had. And yet, if things fell apart, if our marriage crumbled, I knew how it would end. Mason would land on his feet. He always did. He'd walk away untouched, maybe even relieved. And me? I'd be nothing. That thought, that certainty, was what changed everything. I started thinking ahead, just like Mason always did. If I was going to come out of this with anything, I had to be smart. I had to play the game the way he did. No emotions. No second guessing. Just strategy. So, I started gathering information. I paid closer attention to Mason's habits, his routines, the people he surrounded himself with. I asked questions I had never asked before, casual, offhand inquiries that never raised suspicion. I went through financial statements, business records, anything that might be useful if I ever needed leverage. And I was careful. So careful. Because if Mason had taught me anything, it was that the person who stays one step ahead is the person who wins. I told myself it was just preparation. A precaution. Nothing more. But there was a moment, one I still remember so vividly, when I realized I had crossed a line. It was late. Mason was asleep beside me, his breathing steady, his face relaxed in the soft glow of the bedside lamp. I was lying there, staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning with all the pieces I had been collecting. And suddenly, the thought came, crystal clear. I could do this. I would do this. I didn't know then what the final plan would look like. I didn't have all the details figured out. But I knew one thing for certain, when the time came, I would not be the one left empty-handed. And I had no doubt Mason would never see it coming. The plan didn't come to me all at once. It wasn't some grand, calculated scheme I had been waiting to execute. No, it built itself slowly, piece by piece, taking shape in the quiet spaces between my growing resentment and Mason's unwavering success. At first, it was just an idea, something I toyed with, bending and reshaping in my mind. I told myself I was only preparing for the worst, that I wasn't actually going to do anything. But then I started testing the waters. Small, careful steps. A question here. A conversation steered in a particular direction there. Watching how people reacted, what they believed without hesitation, what they were willing to assume. And most importantly, what they were willing to believe about Mason. Because that was the key, wasn't it? Mason was respected. Admired. The man who had built himself from nothing. But that kind of success came with an unspoken truth. People loved to watch a rise, but they lived for a fall. I just had to make them see the cracks. So I laid the groundwork. I started talking to the right people at the right moments, friends, acquaintances, even some of Mason's business contacts. Always casual, always with just enough hesitation in my voice to make it sound like I didn't want to say too much. He's been so distracted lately. I don't know, maybe it's just stress. Sometimes I wonder if I even know him anymore. Little seeds of doubt, planted so gently that people hardly noticed. And once doubt takes hold, it grows all on its own. Then there were the documents. The finances. Mason thought I never paid attention to that side of things, but he underestimated me. I knew where the money was, how it moved. I knew what would happen in a divorce if I walked away with nothing but hurt feelings and regrets. And I knew how to make sure that didn't happen. I had the plan, the setup, the pieces all falling into place. But there was one thing I hadn't considered, one thing I never saw coming. Mason. Because for all my careful maneuvering, for all my certainty that I had outplayed him, there was one undeniable fact I had ignored. Mason never lost. The moment I set everything in motion, I thought I had won. It was seamless, really. Too easy. The kind of thing that, once it began, took on a life of its own. Like a whisper that turns into a storm. I had spent months laying the foundation. The careful comments. The well-timed silences. The subtle way I shaped the narrative, never outright accusing Mason of anything, but never denying anything either. People believe what they want to believe. And in a world where powerful men were exposed every day for their hidden sins, all I had to do was plant the possibility. And then step back. I remember the exact moment it started to unravel. The way people's eyes shifted when they saw Mason. The weight of their silence. The way even our closest friends hesitated before speaking his name. He noticed, of course. Mason was too smart not to. But he never confronted me. Never accused me. Instead, he watched. Like he was waiting. At first, I thought it was paranoia. That he was just caught off guard, that he hadn't quite figured it out yet. But as time passed, something shifted in him. Not anger. Not panic. Something worse. Amusement. Like he had seen this coming long before I had even put the plan into motion. And then, just as quickly as I had built the story, it turned against me. The scandal should have ruined him. It should have cost him everything. But Mason wasn't like other men. He didn't play by the same rules. And I was about to find out just how badly I had underestimated him. I thought I had won. For weeks, I watched as the doubt I had planted spread like wildfire. Whispers turned into rumors, rumors turned into accusations. People looked at Mason differently. Some distanced themselves, hesitant and wary. Others leaned in, drawn by the scent of a scandal in the making. I had been careful. Every step calculated. Nothing traceable back to me. Or so I thought. The first sign that something was wrong came when Mason stopped reacting. He didn't fight back. Didn't rush to defend himself. He just watched. Listened. Waited. That should have been my first clue. Mason never made a move without knowing the outcome. I remember the night it all came crashing down. We were at home, the air between us thick with the kind of silence that had settled in long before the scandal began. I had been expecting something, a confrontation, an argument, maybe even a desperate plea. But when Mason finally spoke, there was none of that. Just a quiet, unnerving certainty. "You thought I wouldn't find out," he said, setting his glass down on the counter. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to keep my expression neutral. "Find out what?" He let out a soft chuckle. Amused. Almost pitying. "Hannah," he said, shaking his head. "Come on." There was something about the way he looked at me in that moment, like I was a child who had tried to outsmart an adult and failed miserably. And then he laid it all out. The conversations I thought had been discreet. He had known about them. The doubts I had planted. He had seen them coming before I had even spoken them aloud. The worst part? Mason had never been in any real danger. Because while I had been busy weaving my story, he had been unraveling it. One by one, he had traced back every whisper, every planted seed of doubt. He had turned the tables before I even realized I was losing. And then, in the final blow, he did what I never expected. He didn't expose me. He didn't scream or threaten or demand to know why. He just smiled, took a sip of his drink, and said, "You really thought you could beat me at my own game?" That was when I knew. I hadn't won. I had never even been playing. Mason had been steps ahead the entire time. And now, as I sit here, rejected from yet another job, watching him thrive while I struggle to even stay afloat, I finally understand. I thought I had been in control. But Mason had let me build my own trap. And I had walked right into it. Mason didn't destroy me. He didn't have to. I did that all on my own. After that night, there were no dramatic fights, no screaming matches, no desperate pleas for forgiveness. He didn't throw me out or gloat in his victory. He simply let things play out the way he knew they would. The scandal collapsed in on itself, crumbling under the weight of the truth. Mason didn't just survive it, he used it. Turned it into another calculated win, spinning the accusations into a story of resilience, a lesson in overcoming adversity. The investors who had hesitated came back twice as eager. His business thrived. His reputation grew stronger. And me? I became the woman who had tried to ruin him. The one who had lied. Manipulated. Betrayed. Nobody said it outright, but I could feel it in the way they spoke to me, in the way job interviews ended with polite, forced smiles and empty promises of a call that never came. My name had become a quiet warning, passed along in hushed conversations behind closed doors. Even my so-called friends distanced themselves. Not because they knew the full truth, but because no one wants to be associated with a sinking ship. And Mason? He walked away without a scratch. No, that's not true. He walked away better. And the worst part? He never once looked back. I thought I would hate him for it. That I would spend the rest of my life resenting him, cursing his name, waiting for karma to finally catch up to him. But sitting here now, staring at another rejection email, another reminder of how far I've fallen, I realize the truth. I don't hate Mason. I envy him. Because he was always the one in control. Because he saw me for exactly who I was before I even figured it out myself. Because while I was busy trying to take him down, he had already planned his next move. And because, in the end, I lost.